Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the chair of our board, Alan Broadbent, and the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you here today to our session on governance models for successful regional transit. Who owns it? Who pays for it? Who delivers it? And thank you for coming back this week after we had to cancel last week because of the weather. And when I started out this morning on those icy sidewalks, I was really worried we weren't going to make it today, but it looks pretty nice out there now. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank our sponsors of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maitree, the Province of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. I'd also like to thank our team here at IMFG who put all of this together last week and again this week, Thomas Hatchard and Manini Shekhar, and the event staff and technical staff here at the Munk School. If you are tweeting about this event, and of course we encourage you to tweet about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks. I think it's on the, oops, did I just do something I shouldn't have done? Thank you. IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is at IMFG Toronto. The subject for the discussion today is regional transit governance. Who should make transit decisions? Who should run the system? Who should pay for it? Simple questions, right? Fortunately, we have three experts here today to help us answer these questions and to explore how different metropolitan areas around the world have confronted these issues. We will look at Toronto, but we'll also look at New York, London, Paris, and other cities to see how different models of regional transit governance have succeeded or not. In particular, how have they been able to balance regional and local interests at the same time? As you know, this discussion is timely. We have talked about transit in this region for a very long time, and now the provincial government is looking to upload Toronto's subways. Our speakers this afternoon will look at why we need to talk about regional transit governance and tell us what works and also what doesn't work. To guide us through these complex issues, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Drew Fagan. Drew is currently a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and he has had a distinguished career in the civil service at the provincial and federal levels. Drew spent 4 years as Deputy Minister of Infrastructure in Ontario with responsibility for Ontario's long-term infrastructure plan. He was Deputy Minister responsible for the 2015 Pan-Parapan American Games and Deputy Minister of Tourism, Culture and Sport. Before that, Drew was in Ottawa, and actually he was there this morning as well, and we're lucky he flew back in time, where he served as Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy and Planning at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, now Global Affairs Canada. Please welcome our moderator for this afternoon, Drew Fagan.
Thank you, Enid, and thank you all for coming out. Second time round. Lots of familiar faces. This is a fantastic subject, obviously. As Enid said, I was Deputy Minister of Infrastructure at Queen's Park, just over here for 4 years. I thought I solved all the infrastructure problems in this town, but evidently not. So let me just put a little bit of context around things, both Canadian, Ontario, globally a little bit to start off with, and then we'll bring it down to ground level where we want to get with our three expert panelists. And it's really just about everywhere. It's about structure. It's about the amount of money we spend, after all, and we are spending more. Let me make that point, and I'll give you a couple of statistics. And it's about the politicization of the decision-making process and the degree do we allow facts to drive things as opposed to political preferences. And that's precisely what I teach at the master students at the Munk School. We are spending more. We're spending substantially more, it's not well recognized, substantially more in Canada than we did. Let me give it, the federal government, twice what they were spending 10 years ago. It was $90 billion over 10 years, it's now $180 billion over 10 years. At the provincial level, it's substantially more as well. 2010, 2011, when I was deputy minister, it was about $100 billion over 10 years. The last budget, and we'll see what the new government does in its first budget, was about twice that, about $200 billion over 10 years. But the fundamental question is how effective that spending is. And by the way, of that money at the provincial level, and this is true all across the country, the majority of it goes to transportation. If you think about overall government spending, you think healthcare. Think of transportation and balance between transit increasingly and roads and bridges. Think of transportation in the capital budget really as the healthcare of capital spending. It's really almost about 60% of total spending. So there is substantial money. And the question we need to ask, perhaps, is why we aren't getting better value of it from that. Part of that, I think, is we didn't spend for about 25 years and we're still catching up. But part of it as well is the decisions we make and the structure we have. Some countries are actually doing it better than we are, and I think we can learn from others. I would cite in particular Australia, which does cost-benefit analysis, deep cost-benefit analysis through Infrastructure in Australia, an arm's-length agency, not politicized, for any project over a certain scope and scale that involves significant federal government spending. The National Infrastructure Commission in Great Britain is really cock of the walk with regard to thinking deeply about where the country should be in fundamentally important sectors. I would cite broadband in particular. I would cite environmental sensitivities with regard to climate change. Those two, New Zealand as well, I think have depoliticized the infrastructure decision-making process and done long-term planning as well. We have done some of that in Canada, but not to the same extent that they have. I think the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which has not insignificant funds, $35 billion to spend, in part to drive greater private sector involvement in infrastructure, including in Toronto and regional transit, but more fundamentally to drive decision-making about data, to advise upstream and have better information about how we're doing downstream. And we often don't have that in this country, in part because we don't price our infrastructure well. Of course, just to bring it down to the topic now that we want to talk about, we are building. The big move is at the provincial level is a significant initiative. And at the same time, we've got, to top things off, the added controversy of the upload, which really brings us down to the topic of today and the fundamental questions of regional transit governance. How well do we do it in the GTHA? What can we learn from others? And the principles and practices of getting it right. And we've got three great people here today to discuss that, experts in the field. We're going to start off with Mike. Let me introduce all three of them. Michael Schabas has the main speaker, 40 years of experience in planning, funding, construction, and operation of rail passenger and urban transportation systems, played leading roles shaping Vancouver's SkyTrain, a big success, and London's Jubilee Line extension, the Docklands, Light Railway, and Overground, Britain's first high-speed rail. Since 2014, he's been providing advice to Metrolinx on the upgrading of Toronto's commuter network into electrified regional express rail, although I must emphasize he's not talking on behalf of Metrolinx today, I know, and he's partner of the UK-based global rail strategy consultancy, FCP. Patricia Wood, or Tricia Wood, she's known as Professor of Geography at York University and a co-founder of its City Institute. She's a co-author of Code Red TO's recent transport report worth reading, Mixed Signals, Toronto Transit in a North American Context. She also writes a transit and urban affairs column for Spacing. And I'm going to cite one of her recent columns when we get to the discussion. Joe Berridge is well known to many of you, an urban planner, city builder, has been the strategic advisor of development in the city centres of Manchester, Belfast, Cardiff, and for the waterfronts of Toronto, Singapore, Sydney, Cork, London, and Governor's Island, one of my favorites in New York City. He's now planning the new hub for the Toronto Pearson International Airport. He teaches at U of T, in fact, and is a senior fellow at the Monk School. He's got a new book coming out in a couple of months, Perfect City, published by Sutherland House. So here's the way it's going to work. Michael's got about 25 minutes to go through some slides. They have a global perspective. We've looked at it in advance. It's fascinating. Then Patricia and Joe are going to have about 10 minutes each to comment on Michael, have their own perspective. We're going to talk about the upload, but we're going to talk about so much more than that. I'll lead a moderated discussion among the three of them for 15 minutes or so. That takes us to a little over half the time. And then you're going to have a good 30 minutes, 35, 40 minutes to get your oar in. And we'll be out of here at roughly 6 o'clock. So how does that sound? So with that, let me turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Joe. It's a real honor to be here in my hometown, which is, I think, emerging from 30 years of transit stagnation to some degree. And this is a very timely discussion we're having today. I've got a lot of slides. I could probably talk on this subject for, some of you know me, 20 hours, not 25 minutes. So I'll race through quickly. You've heard about my background. I got back into Toronto transit about 5 years ago with the NEPTIS report. Marcy's here from the NEPTIS Foundation. And if people haven't had enough of me today and they want more, you can go back on the website and you can still download it. It's 5 years old. It's 100 pages long. It's pretty comprehensive, and pretty much most of it still applies, and quite a lot of good seems to be coming from it too, which is including the GO expansion project. I'm going to race through. You'll notice that I haven't said here who owns. I'm going to kind of dodge that question a bit. We'll talk more about it later. To me, it really is what works. I've spent 40 years now around the world, 30 outside of Toronto, in a lot of different cities, a lot of Sydney, Australia, China, Africa, a lot in London, some in Germany, 3 years in Germany, and I've seen what works and what doesn't work, and really what I care about is what works. Sorry, that's the slide I should have been showing you. And Honolulu, worst place I ever lived. Well, look at the other ones, you know. So to me, these are what it's all about. These are what are important. I want transit. I'm an architect originally and a city planner. I want to create great cities. Great cities have great transit systems. I think it was the mayor of Bogota said a successful city isn't one where the poor people have cars. It's where the rich people use public transit. How many people drove here today? Come on, own up, own up. Not very many, actually, right? You would not find that. In London, you would find nobody raising up their hand. But even in Paris, you would find a lot of people raising their hands at an event like this. And in Montreal, certainly many more. But in Toronto, very few, and that's really good. Toronto's still a very successful transit city in that way. Second is deliver for low capital and operating costs. It's not how much you spend, it's what you get for it. Cost-benefit analysis, really important. What's also really important is good, well-designed schemes that get you good benefit-cost ratios. So when someone said, oh, this scheme's not worth it, it's only got a benefit-cost ratio of 0.3, I say, you're right. Let's go back to the drawing board and come up with a better scheme. Not fiddle the numbers, come up with a better scheme. And if you read the NEPTIS report, I'm a pretty harsh critic of a lot of the schemes that were going on, but also point to some very successful ones and show how to make them better. Fast, frequent service that is competitive and attractive to use. Basically, better than driving, and for the entire population. But you'll notice on my list, I don't have redistribution here. To me, when we have perfect transit, when everyone says transit system is wonderful, then we can start trying to have our transit system do redistribution. Until then, I'm going to leave other parts of the social services to do with redistribution. Education, healthcare, the welfare system. To me, when I'm told that I've got to change the design of my transit system because there's some redistributive idea or something in the fare structure, I say, is that going to make the transit system work better or worse? It's okay if it's not going to change it, but if it's going to make it worse, then I say, wait a minute. When we get everybody out of their cars, then we can tackle redistribution. It's important that fares do not deter use. Now, that's not the same thing as having them low, and I'll come back to that. And the last one I think is very important, subsidies that are not a burden on taxpayers. We're kidding ourselves if we think the answer to transit is to just raise taxes and spend more money. It's not going to happen. Why is transit so difficult? Each city has unique characteristics. I've lived in half a dozen cities and commuted by transit in them. Not many people have done that. Not many people in the transit industry have done it. Very few local politicians have done it. I mean, practically a definition of a local politician is someone who stayed in the same city all their life. So they will have gone to another city on holiday, maybe rode the system once. I'm amazed at how few people in Toronto have ever been on the Montreal Metro and looked at it and thought how it's different from the Toronto subway. Second is legacy investments. People have to understand the Toronto subway was built it was started in 1946. It was designed, I think, in the 1930s. You can't change it. You're stuck with it. And you have to understand that technology. The streetcar system. These legacy investments, it's not like a computer system where you can go back to the store and say, give me the new model, I'll throw the old one out. The third one, and I think this is very important doing comparative analysis, cities have different geographies. The ultimate city planner in Manhattan was the guy who made deep rivers on the side of a narrow rock in the middle of a river. And that made Manhattan what it was. It was a great place to dock a sailing ship, so they built a city there, and it was only a couple hundred years later they sort of ran out of land and had to start building skyscrapers. Los Angeles, that never happened. San Francisco, it's happening right now, but in a different way. Toronto is a 180-degree city, and that's very important. I say it's half of London. London is a 360-degree city, but without a freeway system into downtown. Toronto is half of London. It's got the lake as the other half. Toronto's 6 million people. It's a half a city of 12 million. It shapes the whole geography. Honolulu only has 800,000. It's building a transit system. It's out of control, cost-wise, because they're doing it wrong, but it needs it because it's really 1/10 of a city of 10 million people. You've got to know that. People even have to know their own city. How many people here have ridden the Scarborough RT ever? Well, that's pretty good. That's a good turnout. I guess this is an unusual crowd, too. I suspect if you went to city council or the legislature, fewer hands would come up. Finally, it's challenges of working in any complex technical area. I've been doing it 40 years. I keep discovering new stuff. 30 years ago, I thought I knew half of what there was to know in this business. Now I think I know about a quarter of it, and I keep learning. But there are a few key things you have to understand. Okay, there's unintended consequences of just about everything. The second is staff and producers can capture the industry. People say, oh, well, we asked them, they're the experts, they run the system. Well, that might be like asking the doorman in your apartment building to build you another apartment building. He knows how that building works. He knows how to fix the furnace and who to call when the elevator breaks, but that doesn't mean he knows how to build a building. You know, I've just moved into a condo, and it's a pretty nice condo because it was an architect who's built lots of condos. And I guess he's gotten better. Probably his first one wasn't so good. How many people build lots of metro systems? Not many people. You know, TTC gets to build a subway every 20 years. So think what that means in terms of the learning cycle, you know? It's a bit like earthquakes and things like that. You know, the people who remember the last earthquake or the last tsunami in Japan, they're dead. So they've gone and built the houses back in the wrong place. Finally, the experts may have their own agendas, political, financial, whatever. Toronto does really well on some statistics. It's got, the city of Toronto has just about the highest transit ridership in North America. Canadian cities are on the left. American cities are on the right, with some Australian ones way off to the right. But if you average out the GTHA and the city of Toronto, it's not so good. It was much better. I think there's a saying, Toronto is Vienna surrounded by Phoenix, I think was the line. That doesn't mean the transit is well run. It means that the geography of the city favors transit, and it has a decent transit system. Melbourne's actually got much lower density suburbs, and it doesn't do too badly on this, does it? American cities have tax, political fragmentation, race, crime, subsidies to highways, all kinds of things. So to me, making comparisons with American cities are almost pointless. I mean, yes, you should look at them, they're nearby, and you should understand them. But when you start drawing lessons from them, it's extremely dangerous. You might as well go there to try to learn how to run healthcare or gun control. Toronto 50 years ago led the world. And in fact, 35 years ago, it was my job with UTDC. I would take international visitors around Toronto and show them what a wonderful transit city it was. And this is one of my old slides. St. Clair and Yonge, Eglinton and Yonge. You could tell where the subway stations were. And that's what made the subway successful and still successful. Since then, this has happened. I think this is actually an old picture. But Toronto has one of the most concentrated downtowns in the rich world. Okay, yeah, obviously Hong Kong's on an island. But if you look at cities where there is high car ownership, high incomes, Toronto is almost unique in the density. The fact that within Union Station there are 200,000 people who can walk into their office without even going outside, and 400,000 people who are within 10 minutes on the subway. There aren't many places in the world like that. Also remarkable is what you see when you get off a plane at Pearson. And in my work, I bring a lot of Brits over here now to work on rail projects, share their experience. And they got off the plane and said, oh, that's quite a skyline. I said, that's not Toronto, that's Mississauga. Those are condos. And you can't actually walk between them. It's not really a downtown. But you say, they say, why do people live in the suburbs in condos? Don't they want houses with gardens and barbecues? Well, now the weather's not so good for gardening. And the taxes and so on, we don't get the tax subsidies Americans get, which is a big thing to buy a big house out in the suburbs. And they're not afraid of apartment buildings because they're not afraid of people different colored skin. In fact, most of them are. And so that's all good stuff. This is really good for Toronto. Another thing about Toronto, most people think Toronto has a freeway system. They get off the plane and they see 401 and say, oh yeah, it's American City, right? Yeah, Toronto's got 6 lanes into the downtown core. So, 3 on the Don Valley, 3 on the Gardner, and usually one of them's closed for repairs. So how many people think Houston has got 10 or less freeway lanes? Nobody. Put up your hand when you think got the right number. 20. 30. Okay, the right answer is 43 in and another 43 out of the downtown that is smaller than Toronto. They've got a light rail system too, but guess what? It doesn't get so many riders because when you have 43 lanes of freeways and all the parking you want, people are going to drive. 43, and that's proper freeway lanes. They got arterial roads too. This is pretty staggering. Montreal's got more than Toronto. Montreal's got twice as many as Toronto, by the way. Low crime, favorable transit culture. People aren't afraid to go on the bus here. American cities, a lot of people never go on public transit, and you see people wearing suits and ties. Someone was telling me, he said, in Montreal, you don't see people with suits and ties so much on the metro these days. Certainly not in Paris. Municipal governments that actually work, and because by and large they do work, the streets have sidewalks here in the suburbs, and they even plow the snow on them most of the time. Usually you can get to the bus stop. Try doing that in Dallas, in a suburban Dallas. We have growth-driven planning, and that's a big difference from England. England, everybody is against development. There isn't the densities, and these are all good things for transit. We're in Canada, and I'm really proud to be Canadian. It makes me feel good being here. But Toronto is also not a single city. It's not like Greater London. It's got multi-centers, and I don't think anybody's proposing seriously that Mississauga or York Region should merge with the city of Toronto. And that's important when we come to governance. How do we deal with that? There are lots of other cities in the world that do have this issue. Germany is a great example. I had a bus company, actually, in the Rhine-Neckar region in the town of Speyer, and which we also ran up into Rhine-Main region in Frankfurt. And the Rhine-Main Verkehrsverbund Transport Association has 40 different transport operators in about 40 different municipalities. It's got streetcars, it's got our electrified commuter trains, it's got subways, it's got buses, it's got some sort of privately owned, and some are publicly owned, but all an integrated seamless system. And for the average passenger, they don't even know. Unless they look at the letters on the side of the bus, they didn't know. They have integrated fares. You can go anywhere on the system. Toronto's problems are we don't. We got lack of transit integration. We have these sort of mega zones, which are the municipalities, but if you happen to live in Thornhill and you work at Steeles and Yonge, I think you pay $6 to ride the bus 4 kilometers down the road. It's crazy. The bus routes aren't planned across the municipalities boundaries in a coordinated way. The buses don't generally feed the GO stations, partly because when the GO trains only run in the peaks, who's going to run a bus to them? The bus company I had in Speyer ran buses to and from the commuter rail station, which had a train every 15 minutes all day, into Mannheim. It also went to the shopping center, went to school, the hospital, and guess what? It made money. It actually operated without any subsidy. It was privately owned. It was within the Municipal Transit Association. This guy had this 8-year right to run the route, and he ran it without any subsidy. The fares were fully integrated. You could get on it. You could buy a ticket to anywhere in the region. What's most frustrating, I think, to people is the slow transit expansion to the suburbs. And they do say, my sister-in-law lives out in Schabas. She says, why isn't there a subway? Toronto, everybody seems to have a subway. We love the subway. And people do love the subway, even though it's kind of creaking a bit these days. And they're asking, what's happened? And that's one of the things I think we're trying to tackle here this evening. So I'm just going to look at one example of planning. So it's who planned this. This is the Vaughan Extension, York University, opened a couple of years ago. That's Murray Ross. I found this picture. And he thought he was doing really well. Someday there was going to be a great university. Somebody should have told him to pick his desk up and move 2 kilometers east next to the railway. Because they spent the next 50 years saying, when are we going to get a subway? When are we going to get a subway? If he just built he'd found a farmer's field 2 kilometers east, he would have had a railway already long ago, because the railway was there. There weren't passenger trains on it, of course, but with a university there would have been. That's the line. I guess probably, how many of you have ridden it to the end here? Probably just as many hands. Pretty good, eh? That's good. And so I ask a bunch of questions. Why is it in a tunnel? I mean, the trains come out at Eglinton. They're up out of the ground at Wilson Yard. Why do they go back in a tunnel to go under an industrial area? I mean, it's daft. You could have bought the warehouses or gone over them for a fraction of the price. Why do they follow the city streets? Was someone afraid of going and knocking on the door of the guy who owns a warehouse and saying, we really need to run a railway over here. We'll pay us some money. It's going to be a lot shorter. It's going to be a lot cheaper for everybody. I mean, these are industrial buildings. There's York University. It's got 2 stations. I think those stations cost $300 to $400 million apiece. I think you'll ask the question about whether York University really needed 2 stations. They wanted one in the middle of the campus, and the one on the north side, which is called Pioneer Village, well, it's near the tennis courts. That's good during the championships. And it's near the parking lots. I'm not sure the logic of that. And it's next to the bus terminals. The bus terminals are beautiful, by the way. And I use the plural because they are beautiful. The only question is, why are there 2? Why is there one at the south end for the TTC and one at the north end for York Region? Now, I can't imagine there are many people who transfer between TTC and York Region buses. But it does seem a bit odd that you have to have separate bus terminals for the separate bus operators. And if you want to change between the 2, you've got to go down to the subway station, walk the length of the platform, and come up at the other end. Just, who planned this? It also took 10 years to build. That's a long time. The original subway in 1947 opened in 54, went right up the middle of Yonge Street, and it took them quite a bit less time. This is a great station. It's called 407. It serves a cemetery and some high voltage power lines. This is also really clever. The interchange between the GO trains and the subway, they had to have one, of course. Good idea. They put it at Downsview Park. That way, if you want to change between the GO train and the Finch LRT, you get to ride the subway too for one stop. I mean, this is pretty basic transport planning. You try to make those hubs work together. And you can see the line on this map that what it could have been. And as I said, each of these stations costs $300 or $400 million. I don't think anyone can claim that these stations are serving local communities. None of them are really within walking distance of, this is not walkable communities. Somebody said we got to have one at Jane. Well, it's not even at Jane and Finch, is it? It's at Keele and Finch. So I sort of scratch my head and say, we can do better. Now, on who pays, you've got to ask the question, why is transit different from water, electricity, and telecoms? Nobody proposes that we subsidize those. You pay on an average cost basis. There are probably quite a few economists here. Those are all natural monopolies that are sold on average cost pricing, full cost recovery. And, we give people welfare checks if they're poor, and they use them to pay for their water and electricity. But we don't say, oh, no, we have to price electricity lower so everyone can have the lights on. We used to cross-subsidize telephones. We used to charge more for long-distance calls. This was 50 years ago. And local lines were very cheap, if you recall. And they had dials on them. But that's pretty much gone, too. So, and until 1970. Until 1970, TTC covered its operating costs from fares. Until 1960, it even paid most of the cost of subway construction. The province chipped in with extra money to finish the Bloor Danforth subway. That's when it really started. But I think the university subway was paid for by the city entirely, up as far as Museum, another great station. Province was spending money on roads. They were widening 401. They said we don't want to build we can't afford freeways. I mean, the Spadina Expressway, I think, was canceled as much because what it was going to cost as what it was going to do to this neighborhood. Wages were rising faster. They couldn't raise transit fares. They didn't want to. They abolished the zone system. And I think many people consider that to have been it was a decisive moment in the evolution of transit in Toronto. And it meant that transit no longer became something that paid its way. It was something that was reliant on operating subsidies. Only to, still 70% OPEX recovery is pretty good. But it's really important in what it meant in terms of price signals to transit users and to the transit operator. And if you're not making money carrying someone and you're running buses there, you're probably not going to try so hard to add to vehicles. And I think any transit agency, even if they're told they're operating on a subsidy basis, they must still be looking and understand where they make money, where they lose money. I came up today on the Spadina streetcar. It's got to be a cash cow. These trams are full day and night, going trips of 1 or 2 kilometers. It's probably a little different running the Finch East bus. They're still full. But I don't think, great, we got $3 more from that person that got on. Toronto fares quite well. Some people say that that's wrong, that the fact that Toronto gets 80% cost recovery is bad. I think that's a kind of a bizarre logic to it, but we can debate it later. You see Toronto there, 80%, Go Transit, 75, 80%. All the other Canadian cities above 50%. Of course, when you move out into the regions around Toronto, it drops to lower rates. So pricing, transit should be priced, as an economist, it should be priced at marginal cost. Marginal cost varies enormously through the day. Somebody who is a peak commuter costs a lot to carry. You have to buy them a seat, a vehicle, basically. But most of the time, the marginal cost is very low. Our current fares are too low to recover marginal cost on the peak, way too low. And maybe that's okay. If the government can afford it, that's fine. In most cities, radial commuters, and on the GO system, radial commuters pay a higher fare. And on the GO system, I think it is certainly at marginal cost to carry people. You work out what it costs to run an extra train. The person coming in from Clarkson who pays $6 or $7 is paying marginal cost, and that's about right. But we way overcharge people making short trips within the city. Somebody who lives in, Jane and Finch wants to drive down to the hospital where they work, then go to the shopping mall, then go pick up the kids from school, then go home. Well, they used to have to pay for the kids too. Those people buy cars because it's cheaper than riding transit, even though the buses are running empty most of the day. And that's crazy. So a smarter fare system would certainly charge less for off-peak short trips. That's the Karlsruhe zone system. That's a typical German fare system. And basically, you don't have to understand it. It's okay, because you just know where you're going. It's like the London fare system. People say, the fare system has to be simple. Yeah, it has to be simple. You touch your card, and they take your money, and you have to trust it. And I know the guy who runs the London system, he says, trust it, He says, in fact, we worked out that one time in a million, we actually overcharge people. But don't worry about it, because, sometimes we undercharge you too. It's not perfect, but you got to trust us. We're not crooks. It's a public transit system. So the fare system is run by the government, and that's appropriate to run in the case of Germany, actually by quasi-government, because the private operators are members too. Okay? That's actually the price list for the Frankfurt system. You take a quick look. I'm going to test you on it later. Okay? Transit's not simple. If it were simple, they wouldn't need, it'd be easy. But that doesn't mean you have to understand that to use it. That's London, and that's just the press. So I got a question here. Most of you have been to London, right? You've traveled on the system. Who thinks the average fare per passenger kilometer is higher in London than it is in Toronto? Come on, be honest. Most of you, right? So I explained about who should really pay. Peak commuters into central London pay if they're between 20 and 60 years old. They pay a lot. Not a lot more than the GO system, actually, but they pay quite a lot. When you think about it, who really pays their fare if you're a peak commuter into the downtown Toronto or central London? It's actually the landowners who own the land under the buildings, under the skyscrapers. It really is reflected right through into the value of the land, because those places can't exist without the transit system. If you travel in the off-peak, you get a lower fare, typically a third less, but it varies how far out you're coming from and how many trips you make. They have capping, so if you make lots of trips, you start to have free trips. But everybody else hardly pays anything at all. That's me, top left, I'm over 60. I ride into central London about 3 times a year in the peak. I mean, I go all the time when I'm there the rest of the time. But like, I'm an old guy, what do I need to go in at 8:30 in the morning for? The train's too crowded. I can go for free at that time, but I don't. So I don't cost much to carry. They give me this card every year. I couldn't buy this card for less than, I think, £4,000. And me and probably a million other people over 60 in London get this card every year, and we think this is a wonderful thing the government is giving me. I will vote for those people. I will vote for that government to raise fares for the 20 to 40-year-old, or 20 to 60-year-olds. I don't care. In fact, it makes this free card more valuable to me in perceived value. I use this all the time. I've got friends who are seriously rich. When they turned 60, they started using transit. They left the Ferrari in the garage because they thought it was so cool having this free pass. It didn't hurt that transit in London has got so much better. The buses are clean. Oh, okay, I'm getting a time warning. If you're unemployed, you get a discount card. If you're a student, most of the transit operators, the train and bus operators in southern England, now break even, cover their full operating costs, even cover the full renewal of their equipment, and on some of the rail lines, even the infrastructure. I was pleased to see that Toronto's getting nicer seats on the buses again, finally. If you want to get rich people out of their cars, they got to be comfortable. The bus volumes are spectacular, so they're comfortable buses. Okay, Go expansion. Go to the Metrolinx website, download the full business case, and better yet, read the initial business case for RER because it actually gives more detail. Basically, Go covers its operating costs from fares, and the business case expects that, in fact, like rail lines in other cities, it will generate operating surpluses. Not enough to pay back the capital it costs, of course. Government has to pay for those, or somebody has to pay for those. Who delivers? Doesn't have to take 10 years. The Canada line in Vancouver, twice as long as the Line 1 extension, just as much tunnel, just as many underground stations, built in 4 years under a DBFOM contract. If you want to build complicated railways, you need the best people from around the world. Governments just can't hire them directly. They have to find a way to do it. They can't do it within the straitjacket of a public procurement. That's why lines like the Eglinton Crosstown are being delivered as AFPs, because they're just too complicated to do in a public sector where every time you say, oh, we forgot that, we need it next week. Well, we better go out to tender. That's going to delay the project 6 months. Look around the world, vast range of models of who delivers. These are all lines. These are lines operated by private companies in other cities. The funny thing is half of them aren't really private or partly private. Keolis is half owned by the Quebec government pensions, and the French Railways is the other half. But it's running London Thameslink and Boston Commuter Rail. There's nothing wrong with this. They're tapping into international skills. So when you say who owns, well, it's who delivers. Page by page, you can see ownership in London is scattered all over. Most of the buses in London are privately owned, but not all of them. Many of the rail lines are privately owned. They're operated under different contract models. They're complicated. Another 25 minutes, we could cover them. Or you can read about them in the NEPTIS report. Frankfurt, quite a mixture. I said there are 40 different transit operators, big and small. Singapore is probably not a great model because it's basically rather opaque regulation, but it is actually almost all privately run and operated. Hong Kong, that's the People's Republic of China for you. Everything's private. Who should plan? Okay, it's got to be planned at a regional or higher level if you're going to talk about regional transit. But planning bus routes, streetcar lines, those are at a local level, obviously. You want to have integrated fares. You want to set minimum standards. But local councils can still determine the final details. If they want to have a service to a local school, an extra school or a library on a Sunday afternoon and it doesn't meet the main guidelines, that's fine. That's how it works in Germany. It's a real mix. It's complicated. Who should pay? You should have smart fares. See how far that gets you. You should get pretty far with that. Toronto recovers 70% operating cost. I'm not going to speculate, but I think with a smarter fare system, you could do a lot better. Beyond that, of course, property taxes, general taxes, transit-oriented development, This is not Hong Kong. We're not on a rock. Land isn't all owned by the government. But there still must be more potential to negotiate, do negotiated deals. I worked for the Canary Wharf developers. They paid a lot of money. You can read about it in my book, to get a line. Nowhere near what it cost to build it. They did pretty well too. Private developers don't generally do deals that lose them money. Who should deliver? As much as possible. If it's a complicated rail system, you should be using performance-based integrated DBFOM contracts. And you know that that's how the Eglinton Crosstown is being delivered. That's how the Finch West LRT is being delivered. And that process is underway for delivering the GO expansion the same way. Local buses and streetcars, here they're pretty much all municipal. In Western Europe, they're increasingly done by private competitive tender, but against, again, performance-based contracts. And finally, you can read about London in my book, which is available from good bookstores. Thank you. How's that?
I'd like to start by thanking the IMFG for organizing this panel. I'm truly honored to participate today. In response to the questions that frame this panel, who owns it, who pays for it, who delivers it, I want to add a few more. Who uses it, who builds it for whose benefit, and most importantly, who decides. Because we should not discuss this as the context for a proposal in this province as if the question at hand, the only change under discussion, is who pays, when it is also who decides. So to address these questions and to respond to some of the points that Michael raised in his presentation, I'm going to talk about two of my favorite things as a geographer, scale and citizenship. So first, I would like us to be more precise in our language when we talk about regional transit. Regional versus local transit is not defined by mode of travel. It's defined by distance and jurisdiction. And moreover, regional transit can refer to two things. It can refer to transit across the region, and it can refer to the collectivity of transit within that region. But the bigger problem is not the word transit, actually it's the other word, region. So in political geography, a region by definition is not a jurisdiction. It is a term we use for areas that fall in between political jurisdictions. We have regions within the province, obviously, we have regions within countries, we even talk about world regions. And the word is there for that in-between space, one without formal political representation. So what we know about governance and regions is that regions are governance strategies. Regions are spaces of economic and/or cultural imagination. In the case of the GTHA, it is obviously economic, but it's cultural too, and for both of them, there is a flattening, a social and an economic flattening that occurs in our imaginations. Let me explain what I mean by that. One of the elements of regions that makes them so strategically attractive is the way, because they don't exist until we imagine them, we can imagine them as unformed empty spaces. We can imagine them as flat and even, both topographically and socially. In fact, that's the whole point of planning and governing through regions, right? To erase the particularities on the ground and see the region as a flat, singular thing whose needs and purpose and agenda are also singular. But of course, regions are not singular entities. They're complex, they are multi-scalar themselves, and they are constellations of individual places. And those places in the constellation are not the same, and they are not equal. And in the GTHA, there are strong differences in these individual places, particularly in income and well-being, and in access to opportunity. And addressing that unevenness is explicitly incorporated in the City of Toronto's transportation planning. Indeed, but this has not been as explicitly part of the province's or Metrolinx's planning. In fact, one could easily make an argument, and I have, that in their regional planning and in their influence on Toronto city planning, it is predominantly or disproportionately wealthy areas and wealthy commuters that have been prioritized both for road and transit improvements. I do want to note that very recently, in response, in fact, to work done by my colleagues at York's City Institute, Roger Kyle, Sean Hertel, and Michael Collins, Metrolinx has begun to incorporate questions of social equity into its thinking and planning. There's an excellent kind of contextual report they put out in March of 2018. But these ground level differences matter a great deal to transportation planning, because most of us who live in the GTHA spend our daily lives at the scale of smaller places, not the region as a whole. And the majority of those commuting to work every day in the GTHA, in every municipality, travel less than 15 kilometers to do so. The vast majority of us access medical services locally, buy our groceries locally, get our haircut locally, visit a library locally. In fact, the #1 transit problem in the region is actually the need for better local transit, especially outside Toronto. In the city of Toronto, about half of us use a car to do all those tasks I just listed. In the other municipalities of the GTHA, it is 80% or higher. In Burlington, 86% of commuters drive to work. Metrolinx's goals in its 2041 plan for improving mode share for public transit in the region are, I'm sorry to say, pathetic. It will increase from 14.2% to 14.7% over 25 years, and that's if that plan to 2041 is fully implemented. And kilometers of congested driving in the region are still forecast to more than double by 2041 from 3.7 million to 8.1 million. This much change, because to a geographer, this is literally suicidal. Any mobility and land use planning should support the intense localness that is the majority of our journeys. When we connect the dots of the constellation of the region, which we should, that is that movement across the region, we must work with and connect with local systems, that collectivity of local movement within the region. Any planning for mobility across the region that displaces or disrupts local systems is inherently a weakening of the system overall. Any governance structure that uploads local decision-making to an imaginary flat space of something that is not a jurisdiction, the region, which is not the same thing as the province, will inherently weaken the system. Even regional transit needs need to be planned from the ground up, especially as regional transit will not succeed without local transit for the first and last mile of travel. Having said that, it is also important not to fall into what Mark Purcell has called the local trap, where we fetishize the local as an inherently superior form of governance. Local governance can take the form of NIMBYism. Like any other scale of governance, local governance is not immune to racism or open class warfare, and thus local governance is not a certain path to good governance or social justice. So I need to make it clear that that's not what I'm advocating here. What I am advocating is that good governance of mobility is grounded in actual practice of mobility, as well as a commitment to democratic participation and to social and economic justice. Because one of the most important things that transit does is increase economic participation and reduce inequality. It also improves overall well-being and reduces costs in other areas such as health. Mobility is more than a logistical issue. It is also an issue of citizenship and justice. And nowhere is mobility more important than in a city. There is a mountain of scholarship now on the relationship between access to the city and economic and social equity. Now, Toronto has a lot of work to do in this area, but Toronto is doing the best job in the region by far with mobility. In Toronto, even the wealthy, as Michael noted, take transit, 40% versus less than 10% in the GTHA as a whole. So when we ask questions about governance, democracy and citizenship also matter, because citizenship is more than a status. Citizenship is actually a mechanism of equity. The purpose of citizenship is to establish membership in a polity that is not reliant on any other identity, right? That is, everyone is equal regardless of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. But in order for that common shared equal identity to be meaningful, we must act to rectify inequality when we see it. So if we are at all committed to justice, democracy, and citizenship, we are obliged to incorporate them into our consideration of transit governance. So, the TTC should remain under the control of the City of Toronto. But that doesn't mean the majority of its board should be comprised of city councillors. And it doesn't mean the province can't have a seat at that table. And most importantly, keeping the TTC in the city's hands does not preclude the creation of a regional transit agency of some kind with representation from the participating municipalities so that the stakeholders who need to coordinate are all around the same table. Everyone in the world who does transit planning will tell, literally everyone in the world, will tell you that that's how you make good decisions. And we don't do that here. Metrolinx, in fact, is the polar opposite of that, with a board that has no accountability and one that treats the region as a singular entity in its planning with no representation of diverse municipal interests. Toronto's transit governance as a whole is exceptionally weak and vulnerable to partisan political interference. Other cities and urban regions in Canada and the United States don't look like this. So here are some quick good ideas to consider. Chicago is a good comparator. I'm going to do what Michael told us not to do. I'm going to compare us to American cities. Chicago is a good comparator. It's about the same size as Toronto, population-wise and sort of scale-wise. It has a similar system. We spend about the same amount of money. We move about twice as many people in unlinked trips as they do for the same amount of money, but they have twice the network in terms of heavy rail and commuter rail, literally more than twice as many kilometers. But in terms of governance, which is the point here, it has a local city transit agency, it has a commuter rail agency, and then it also has a regional authority as well. And every board of governors has shared governance between the state and the city. And my favorite part is that the governor makes appointments and the city of Chicago makes appointments, and they have to approve each other's choices. Vancouver also has a regional agency, TransLink, which manages the whole region as a whole. And then through the mayor's council and a voting system that can be weighted by population, it then incorporates the voice and accountability of elected officials. Moreover, its board of governors ensures that political appointees are not there for purely partisan reasons, as all nominees go through an independent screening panel. Montreal's governance boards have rider representatives and paratransit user representatives. And all of these cities, with the sad exception of Montreal, and almost every other transit agency in the US and Canada, are supported by dedicated sales or gas taxes that bring in at least $500 million every single year exclusively for transit. That's actually the norm, and the shared governance is more common than not. The closest comparator to the structure now proposed would be the current arrangement in New York City, which was an arrangement, of course, brought about as a state rescue of a city on the verge of bankruptcy, which is not where we are. I was going to say more about New York City, but I'll just note that the state of good repair bill in New York City is worse than ours, and the system is now described by some as being in a death spiral. But just generally, if you watch the politics of the governance struggle between the city and the state government, I really struggle to understand how anyone could look at New York's transit governance and say, I want that. We need to incorporate good governance and a commitment to equity into our planning, and that's been absent from the conversation so far. There are weaknesses in our current governance and planning structures, but that's not an excuse for replacing them with something worse. There are good ideas in other cities in Canada and the United States to learn from, and that's the conversation I hope we will have. Thank you.
Joe.
Those two really great presentations. I must admit, Michael, I'm always fascinated listening to you. This is the only guy I know in the room who's actually owned a railroad, which he told me he bought for £10. I'm not quite sure what you sold it for.
Or, luckily, not enough.
There were a lot of nuggets in what he had to say, and I think it's really time for us, especially in a forum like this, to start thinking about or seizing different ways of thinking about the transit system. And certainly, Tricia gave us some fascinating ones. There are nuggets in both, but one of the ones that I pick up really from Michael, which I hadn't fully appreciated because I've worked a lot in the UK and I use the transit systems there a lot, is quite how many of them make money on an operating basis. This, obviously, one of the things behind all of the governance questions is the question of how the heck do you pay for all of this? And if it is indeed possible to structure our operating transit systems so that to some extent they do return after the fare box, out of the fare box, that certainly becomes to be a very significant change in the way that we think about things. It's also very important because we start to learn from the price signals that the system is giving off. I take absolutely the point about transit planning and the equity of transit funding and pricing. But it's clear that what we have now is not one that is invented to fit either agenda properly. The flat fare system and these incongruities across the region are not working well for any of us. So I've been sort of trying to wrestle, and one of the things I've done in the book, out in 2 months' time, folks, is to look at a whole bunch of cities, I've looked at 8 world cities, and say, well, what's working there and what lessons, in a sense, can we learn from them? And in terms of the best transit systems in the world, it's pretty clear to me that they are two-tier. The best governance systems in the world are two-tier, and the transit systems that flow from them. All cities have a lot of big things to do, and transit planning is one of the big things they have to do. But they also have to be extraordinarily respectful that they resolve issues at the local level. And what seems to be able to absorb those tensions is a two-tier system. So you have a Greater London Council and a Greater London Assembly, and then you have a whole series of 44 boroughs underneath them. In Paris, you have a very similar system, which has now expanded significantly with a Grand Paris and a whole bunch of arrondissements and then suburban municipalities. And even Shanghai, interestingly, is moving towards that kind of system because they recognize stuff goes on at the local level, stuff goes on at the big level. And what we are lacking here very clearly is that governance at the big level. We're talking about what's the region. The region for a transit point of view is the region that people journey to work. And that's what one needs to capture in one's transit governance system. And clearly what we have right now doesn't really do that adequately. I mean, I don't want to say that the City of Toronto doesn't exist, but it really doesn't exist as a transit area. And that's a really important fact for us all to appreciate. What does exist is some amorphous region of somewhere between 6 and 10 million, and that is the transit area, and that's the area that, frankly, right now lacks a coherent governance. The other reason that you have to move up to that higher scale is because that is where the money is. It is impossible, I think, for the City of Toronto to be able to fund its current transit obligations on its current revenue streams. And what we clearly do need to do, I don't think we should be giving up on other revenue streams. We should be looking, I think, at a regional sales tax, a regional income tax, some version of that. That's what Ann Golden recommended and still seems to me to be the logical thing. If you're going to do that, you've got to do it at the regional scale. You can't do it at the local scale. I think we should be looking at regional road pricing, and clearly that's another thing that you have to do at the regional scale. Now, these things are politically impossible right now, but they are absolutely the only way we are going to be able to create something where all mobility is properly managed and properly priced within the region. The other thing that we're missing out on right now is actually designing the transit system for the economic region that we have. And Neptus Foundation gave us wonderful advice on essentially how that region is structured. The transit service to the second largest employment area in the region around the airport is pathetic. And I think 1 million car trips a day, 1 million car trips a day are taken to that area. And clearly, we need to think there about how that is going to be serviced. Because the basic objective, just to step back on all of this, the basic objective is climate change. The basic objective here is that we have to radically reduce the dependence on private gasoline-powered vehicles. And we're only going to be doing that, I think, with some sense of emergency and by doing it at the right scale. I also think that there needs to be this much more structured connection between the transit system and economic development. We talk about the airport area. Maybe the Scarborough subway makes sense if Scarborough Town Centre is a substantial employment zone. And maybe the east end of Toronto needs a really substantial employment zone, which a subway could help fuel. That's the kind of talk that we need to be having, rather than this rather pathetic he said, she said that we've got on that system. Well, clearly, the region is the level at which fare integration needs to be managed. It's also, I think, and this is the real lesson from Michael's stuff, the area at which a super links, which that term has been used, whatever you want to call it, sets the standards, the operating standards and the fare structure for the entire region, and then allows the local level to work out how they're going to deliver that. It is stunning how much privatization there is of operation in in European cities. Every time you see a London bus, don't look at the fact that it's red or the guys are all wearing a uniform. Look on the bottom left-hand corner of the bus and you'll see who actually owns and operates that bus. It is perfectly possible to have the flexibility you need at the local level with a regional level setting standards. So my ideal transit system, and clearly from the experience I've seen around the world, is that of a two-tier system, essentially the upper tier responsible for funding, for planning, for setting standards, for franchising, a local level which is essentially operating within that mandate and tuning the system to local needs. This is absolutely theoretically what we ought to do. I worry like heck that in the Ontario, Toronto provincial climate, this is going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. But I think everybody, as far as I can tell, across the region is struggling with exactly this same quandary. And so I live in hope that we might be able to set up such a regional transit agency and make sure that it's run by Parisians. That way it will work. Thank you.
So let me seed a couple of thoughts and get things going, and then we'll turn it over to you. We have about half an hour. So is the slogan two-tier transit, not two-tier healthcare? How does that work? Does that work? The upload. We were very deliberate in terms of not focusing too much on the upload. It's in the news. Patricia, you were involved, I think, in a petition on that in the last couple of days. Let's get that off the table because it is pretty fundamental. Does it make sense broadly? If it's going to happen, and we have terms of reference for the negotiation agreed between the city and the province last week, how can we make it work? And what do we need to do? It assumes that Metrolinx is going to take over responsibility to make Metrolinx more effective in taking that responsibility. Any of you?
Yeah, I think Joe put it very well. The funding has to come at a regional level. It's always he who pays the piper calls the tune. Right. It's got to be decided at a regional level, and I think clearly the current structure hasn't worked very well, so we do have to change something.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we've got a very muddy conversation. So, I mean, I love this kind of conversation where we actually talk very seriously about evidence-based case studies of other cities and so on. But as Joe points out, I'm not sure we're actually in that environment to have that conversation. So I don't think it should go ahead as proposed. It's not a strong governance model. And it isn't necessary to provide funding, and I assume by regional we actually mean provincial here, that it's not the GTHA that will fund the capital costs. We're talking about the provincial government and more recently now the federal government as well. That again is the norm, so there's nothing weird about that. Ownership in some ways doesn't matter so much if we have a better governance structure, but we don't. Metrolinx started out with a different structure that would have been more to work with, but it's something quite different now, and I don't see us taking that apart now, and that's unfortunate. If it goes ahead anyway, I think there are parallels to other kinds of crises, not just transit crises, and we won't actually see stuff built. It won't be a more functional system. Most of the problems inherent with building things on time and on budget are about the projects themselves, and that's not unique to Canada. That's everywhere. So this isn't an improvement in terms of getting things built and done and on time and on budget. And so we will have more of the same. We will just be yelling at each other from different places.
In theory, I'm an uploader because it just doesn't make any sense to have these very expensive pieces of transit equipment, which in a level of government which can't really afford them, and also which is now expanding out beyond the jurisdictional boundaries of that area. I share actually a lot of your concerns about, but I think we are learning. There's no question that the Crosstown and Finch are infinitely better planned, budgeted, and delivered, or being delivered, than the Spadina line extension was. And that lesson has been learned. And I hate to say it, but that's a top-down lesson. That's an Infrastructure Ontario lesson saying this is the way we're going to do it. And I don't have anything like the faith in the local level that they have the capacity and the resistance to localism. So I think that does have to be top down. The worry I have is that, and not a worry was enhanced by watching the agenda last night, is that every 905 politician will have their own agenda about where that line should be, and in the current political context, that's a very worrisome thing. What's happened with TfL and with RATP in Paris and with some of the other better transit agencies is they've sort of become like the Senate. You don't mess with them. And that's, sorry, Art. And that's where we need to be with a transit agency in the region.
Can I just add one quick note, because I noticed it in Michael's presentation too. These transit systems that we admire in cities are all cities with powerful metropolitan level governments. You know, London's not quite a devolved assembly. It doesn't have quite the same powers as that, but it's pretty close. It's the same for Paris. It's the same for the cities in Germany. You know, better coordination, better management of transit, better coordination of partners too between the municipal and, in our case, the provincial, tends to come with a stronger municipal government, and we have a weaker one.
Sorry, but the problem is that we're not the capital city of a unitary country. You can get away with that in Paris and Madrid and London. We are a 10 million region in a 14 million province, and it's a hell of a problem.
So, Michael?
No, I was just going to pitch in. The mayor, I mean, the TfL board has elected representatives, but it is dominated by the mayor, who is elected by not the whole region really, but everything within the Greenbelt, all of Greater London. If Toronto had that kind of governance, then maybe that would work. But the mayor, he or she really runs it as their fiefdom, and they get reelected every 4 years by how they perform on that, and police, because those are their two main jobs. Boston, it's the governor and his appointee, who is the chairman of the MBTA Financial and Management Control Board. They do have an elected thing made up of representatives of 67 cities and towns in the Boston region, but really it's the governor and his appointee. So,
Joe mentioned Infrastructure Ontario, which has taken responsibility across the Ontario government for infrastructure construction. They started with hospitals, actually, courthouses, stuff that goes up as opposed to stuff that goes linearly, then moved into transit highways as well. Believe it or not, the on-time, on-budget delivery over the last while is much better than it was before. And I think your point about the Spadina line versus the Eglinton line, even if the Eglinton line is going to be about a year late, is a fair one. But Infrastructure Ontario, when I dealt with them at the province, would always make the point, we don't decide what we build. We just work very hard. And Michael, you were talking about the benefits of P3s, which remain controversial. We work very hard to ensure that it's built on time. But you tell us what to build, and we'll build it better. Do we have a fundamental problem with regard to the politicization of the decision-making process here compared to others around the world? And this is a very rich conversation that we don't often get with regard to comparing municipalities globally.
I'll go back and read the business case for GO expansion and for Regional Express Rail. Tell me where you see politics in those documents. I don't think you'll find it. They're both, in my view, I mean, I would say this, very professional documents, driven by professionals in transport planning, benefit cost ratio of 3.5 to 1, fantastic business case. I don't think there's anybody in the Toronto region who doesn't want that system to get built as quickly as possible. But it's a massive project, and if it was done using conventional public procurement, you can imagine what would happen. So but I don't see, the accusation that there's politics in there, I don't see it.
Well, sorry. So the GO expansion and RER project, though, I think, makes a lot of sense. But if we could go back to the other example that you were just mentioning of the extension to York and beyond, so that was originally a project to go to York, and it is the province that said, no, you're taking it to Vaughan. And it is the extension past York to Vaughan that, if you're asking, like, who plans it? Well, that was the province. And that's the part of it that doesn't make any sense. So where's politics involved? I mean, and in recent decisions about, stations on the GO line expansion, right, and in Smart Track, and I mean, we can still come up with lots of them. We can come up with them at the city level, and we can come up with them at the provincial level.
It's also the example of Scarborough
Yes,
subway.
Scarborough.
You know what the acid test is? Will the TTC ever be able to bid to provide any other city's transit? Because the Dutch, the Paris, the Madrid, all these other systems are so efficient, they know what they're doing, that they are actually hired by other cities to run their transit. And we're not there. There is expertise in this, and we have been very dismissive of expertise in how to run transit.
I hear words from the audience, so let's turn it over to you. We do have a microphone. Who wants to start? I think the senator wants to start, and then we can move on.
Thank you, Art Eggleton, retired senator, former mayor. Anyway, Mr. Schabas, we have an affordability issue in this city, particularly for low, moderate income people, and that's particularly notable in housing, but it's also notable in transportation, because a lot of people who can't afford living in the 416 live in the 905 and pay a lot of money and a lot of inconvenience in trying to use the transit system to get to jobs downtown. You showed on one of your slides that Toronto gets more from the fare box, the operated system, than just about any other entity in North America, but you didn't seem fussed by that. You seem to think we could do that and might even do better at it. You mentioned smart in another slide, smart fares and Ramsey principles, and I wonder if you might just expand on that. Are you talking about a system that can operate on its own and still be affordable? Or are you suggesting just the operating part of it could be affordable and the capital has to come from government?
Sure. And I have had people who challenged me, said, oh, they never found a transit system that actually did make money. And the first thing is, if you did have a transit system was making money, you wouldn't talk about it, would you? Because they'd make you lower your fares or pay your staff more or run more services. And part of that actually happens with any transit system. But we have an amazingly dumb fare structure here, that you pay $3 at any time of day to make any length of journey. And in 1950, when it was a nickel to ride everywhere, that was the only way to do it on the system. It didn't really matter because you could only go up as far as Hoggs Hollow, and they got their money back. We still have that fare system, essentially, in Toronto. And the reason they're only getting 14% mode split for trips in the outer boroughs is because it's cheaper to buy a car than to pay $3 every time you want to get on and off. And Code Red argues for a monthly pass. And that was the right answer 30 years ago. The right answer now is what's called capping. In London, we don't have a monthly pass. Well, there sort of is, but not really. It's all different prices. You touch your phone or your credit card or your Oyster card, and every day it figures out how much to cap you at. And if you just use the buses in London, by the way, tourists, because I forgot to say who else we charge the most to. It's not just people who work downtown between 20 and 60 years old, it's tourists. We take you for everything you're worth. But, secret, if all you do is use the bus all day in London with your smartphone, you will never pay more than £4.50. Less than Toronto. You can ride 100 buses in a day and never pay more than £4.50. Isn't that great for redistribution? Now, if you got to make a long distance trip to a job, you live out in Agincourt and you work downtown, you might not want to take the bus all the way. And that's fair enough. And your employer, that's part of the deal with the job. The job has to pay you to make that trip. But there are clever ways to address redistribution and equity and still get more money and have more travel. And Toronto's just not doing it.
So the first thing I should say is that Code Red TO strongly supports capping. The point that we make in our report is that our monthly pass is the worst value pretty much in Canada and the United States. because it doesn't really reward even Monday to Friday commuting travel. The problem with shifting the flat fare zone system in Toronto, although there's other things we can do with fare and should, is that unlike American cities, you wind up penalizing people with lower incomes because they're farther from the city. If you look at an income map of almost any American city, New York's really the only exception, you will see that income gets higher as you go out from the city center. That's not what a map of Toronto income looks like. It's much more modeled, and we have areas of low income at a great distance from the city center. So if we put in fare by distance, that's who we penalize. There's a lot of studies that say fare by distance is fairer. They're American studies. So it won't apply.
I'll come back. I think it was Brad Ross who said we'd never have a fifth zone fare system in Toronto because that would be unfair to people who traveled further. I'm still looking for a bar or a restaurant or supermarket that works on that basis. If you eat more, you pay more. But in London, if you travel after 9:30 or before 7 in the morning, you pay less. If you have a job in downtown Toronto, even if it's making sandwiches or sweeping floors, they probably have to pay you more than the same job out in the suburbs, because that's why you're making the trip. If you want to make transit for poor people, and you should go to Los Angeles if you want to learn a cautionary tale, it's got a great transit system, all designed around linking poor people. Nobody rides it who isn't poor. Nobody wants to. They spent billions on it, building these transit lines. It takes forever to get anywhere. I traveled on it. I was the only person wearing a tie. So.
So I think it's really interesting that we clearly see a tension if we respond to the question that I think it's very interesting. Why is transit important, right? And I think we've heard equity, we've heard economics, and we've heard environmental concerns. So I think that's a main question that would be interesting to answer. Especially, I think we're seeing a tension that I wonder if it's false in some instances, and we also need to think of who uses transit. And if the majority of the population who uses transit, it's lower income populations, then these answers don't have to be in tension. And so I wonder, if there's a little bit of reflection that we could talk about between those three different objectives or different topics of why transit is important.
Well, I think there are, just trying to tease them, I think there are a lot of objectives. Clearly, I think we've got to be very conscious of how we reduce private automobile usage in the metropolitan area. And that, if you were just going at that objective, you'd have a very different transit system from the one we have now, because it would be very much focused on the 905. Clearly, there is also an economic development objective here. You want to have this as being a place where people can easily get to work. We're probably running out of capacity in the downtown right now. So it's an interesting question to say, where will another downtown of real substance emerge in the region? And clearly there's sort of a nascent one around the airport. Maybe there's another one in Downsview that ought to happen. But that, again, you'd say, what's the transit support for that economic development objective? There's the last one, quite frankly, is that it's a quality of life in the city. You should be able to move around in the city at reasonable cost and reasonable comfort with great flexibility. And that's part of the quality of life that we all expect. So it's trying to mesh all of those things together. The fundamental outcome of this is that you just need to build a hell of a lot more transit than you are. You have to really think much more radically about where the money is coming from that, and that's what's so exciting about the kind of things, ideas Michael has got here. And you've got to have some sense of urgency, which is why I am suspicious of the localist answers.
Senator Eggleton, I don't know if you remember when I was chairman of the bicycling committee and you were an alderman, and we were very enthusiastic cyclists, and we thought we wanted bicycle lanes in Toronto. We never thought I never believed we'd have them on Bloor Street. I mean, that would have been dreaming. The thing about transit, people said at the time, oh, we've got to all ride bicycles because the oil's going to run out. So 40 years ago, there were serious people who thought the oil was going to run out. It didn't actually. I don't think global warming's in the same category. It's a serious issue. Equity is very important. We have by world standards, a very unpolarized society here, and that's really good. This country, I tell my friends, it's got the highest Gini coefficient, the best Gini coefficient in the world, as far as I can tell.
Yep.
My mother's cleaning lady has a cottage. Not many places that sort of thing happens. The bad part was she drives to work because it's cheaper than taking the bus. So to me, I'm an architect, actually. You're an architect, right, Joe?
I know.
But you were an architect?
No,
So to
no,
me,
no.
what's most important about transit is it makes better cities. It makes cities where people see strangers on the street, where they walk, where buildings are close together and people can interact in places like that, where they can go home together, where they can have a couple too many glasses of wine maybe at the end of the day and get home safely. Toronto's a great city because it's got a great transit system. Great cities have great transit systems. It's not about that mostly poor people ride it, and I don't think it's true in Toronto that most people who ride transit are poor. Most people who ride transit have jobs. That's a good thing. And the average income of the typical Go rider, I think, is over $100,000. It's $80,000 a year, which is a decent middle-class income, and that's a good thing. There are people from Oakville who drive in their Teslas on the QEW. I think they're stupid. They should be riding the GO train because it's a whole lot nicer. So,
Saw a hand here.
I'd like to go back to about professionals planning transit. At the moment, the next subway extension is being planned by two expert people, Mr. Tory and Mr. Ford. And there's something about that doesn't seem that that's the epitome of expertness.
It's interesting when you talk I/O has really radically changed the way in which the provincial government and all municipalities do business, really radically, and greatly for the better. It's now, I think you would know better, Drew, almost unassailable, isn't it?
And it's a leading jurisdiction.
And it's a leading jurisdiction, and people come from all over the world to see what I/O is doing and how it's doing it. Now, it's a dark, mystical force with absolutely no public involvement at all, and right on, because that's actually, I suspect, closer to the kind of regional transit planning and overall management structure we need.
But again, they don't decide where it's built. They do better on how it's built.
Yeah.
This is the distinction that I would make. I don't think there's anything wrong with relying on experts who know how to build systems and hiring them to build systems, but one of the biggest challenges we face are about where we're building and who's making that decision. I find it very telling that the upload conversation is absolutely dominated by a line to Richmond Hill, and that has been a top 15 project that is now the most urgent project. It doesn't compare to the airport extension. If we were really talking about needing to move people where they're actually moving now and need to get to, like the airport, which is an important employment hub as well, then that's what we would be talking about in terms of this need to upload for better regional integration. Instead, we're talking about extending the Yonge line, not even a new line, but extending the Yonge line, weakening the network to Richmond Hill.
Final question from former city manager Shirley Hoy.
Hi, that was a very interesting presentation. And all of you referred to this notion of to be successful regionally, you're looking at this two-tier approach. I heard it from all of you talking about that. And as soon as you say two-tier, it's always one over the other. But what I also heard from all of you is really talking about two sets of functions, that what you need a structure for is the one that will plan, fund, look at the long term, and determine where the growth should be for the region, right? And the other part you talk about where we've seen success is a really robust operating governance structure that looks at standards, managed well, and integrated, seamless system. So my question is, I think this whole notion of two-tier and uploading scared the heck out of everybody, especially in the city of Toronto. And I'm not sure we're talking about one over the other. I think there are two new regional structures required. One that looks at capital, building, funding, 30 years out planning. The other one, which there has not been this kind of debate on an integrated regional operating transit system that looks at integrating GO with TTC. So you start to take the language away about City of Toronto TTC versus GO. In my mind, if GO could be integrated with Metrolinx, why can it not be linked with TTC and look at a new operating structure, governance structure, for truly GTA transit system? Like, I think we got to start that debate, because this whole thing of talking about whether it's the, Premier 4 want to just upload, immediately the conversation stops, and that's not good. Whereas what I've heard from all of you is great, lessons learned from where there's been success. And the success is people have done well, the functions, capital building versus operating. I mean, finally now we've got the Presto card working most of the time. So if the Presto card works for GO, why in the world can't we get GO TTC together as the new operating entity?
Perfectly put. Nothing more to add.
Surely that was a showstopper. These people who have answered all these questions suddenly went blank. So it's just my job to thank the panel and Drew, the moderator, for a great session today on regional transit governance in Toronto and around the world. Michael, at the beginning of his talk, said this was a very complex issue, but it also turns out to be a very controversial issue. And we could tell that from the different viewpoints we tried to have represented today. I think perhaps there was some agreement on balancing the regional and the local, some notion of a region-wide body and still having lower tiers, although Shirley's translated that more to a capital and planning body and more of an operating body. But there's two things involved here, and I think that's clear. I think, at IMFG, we've always known we draw an unusual crowd. And the fact that most people didn't drive here today, many of you have been on the Scarborough LRT, and it sounds like most people have been to London and on the transit system, suggests we really are an unusual crowd, and we are grateful for you all coming out to our events, and this one in particular. We webcast this event today. As you know, it does take a couple of weeks to have it closed captioned, but it will be on our website. But we will make Michael's slides available sooner than that. I know at the very end, Michael went very quickly through some of the other cities and some of the examples, and there was a little bit of small print. So we'll make those slides available in the next couple of days so that you can refer back to them. Please share the webcast with your colleagues who couldn't come today. And thank you all for coming, and have a great evening.